Topic 4 is going to be a bit longer than the last couple of, I think like the last two topics, but worth it. So we're going to talk about circumference of circles. So we've got a little bit of background information, then a couple of things we have to practice, okay? So you may or may not remember this, but if you're dealing with a circle, the distance around the circle is called the circumference. So it's not the same thing as perimeter, because perimeter is for something called a polygon, which has to have at least three sides, but it mimics perimeter. It's kind of the same idea. It's the distance around. Okay? So the distance around a circle is called the circumference. Now, if we're going to go and talk about the distance through the center, we need to understand something called diameter. Okay? So the distance across the circle through its center, so like the widest point of the circle, if we go all the way through that, that's called the diameter, and it is denoted generally with just a lowercase d. Okay? Now, another really common thing we talk about with circles is something called the radius. Okay? Now, the distance from the center to the edge is the radius, okay? And so what I think I need to do at this point is draw you a figure, okay? So when we draw a circle, we are drawing the circumference. That does represent the circumference of the circle, okay? That's the distance around the circle. Now, we have a point in the center, okay? And if we go from that point in the center just to the edge of the circle, that's the radius. Now, if we go all the way through the circle, so from one side of the circle to the, whoa, I don't know what that was right there. But if we go all the way across the circle through the center, so all the way through it from one point to the other, through the center, that right there is the diameter. So the distance across the circle through its center is the diameter. The distance from the center to the edge of the circle is the radius. And there's this relationship between the diameter and the radius. Well, if I take the radius here, let me do it in red, and I add it to the radius over here, well, two radiuses equal one diameter. So the diameter is equal to two times the radius. Or I could say, well, the radius by itself is half the diameter, or the diameter divided by two. Okay, so that relationship between diameter and radius is really, really important. So we have that kind of listed here. The radius is half the diameter, or we could say the diameter is twice the radius. Okay, now we have to introduce a Greek letter called pi. So here's the symbol for pi, or you can call it pi. Please note this is not PIE, it's just pi, okay? So the Greek letter pi is used in the formula for the circumference of a circle. So pi is approximately 3.14 or 22 over 7. Now, in a previous video, I talked very, very briefly about irrational numbers. So irrational numbers are numbers that can never be written as a fraction. So they're decimals that do not have a fraction equivalent. Pi is an example of an irrational number, and that means it's a number that never terminates, it never repeats, okay? Which is somewhat, problematic for us because we need to use it in formulas. Well, we can't sit here and write out pi to like a gazillion decimal places. So we always estimate pi as either 3.14, or sometimes we'll use 22 over 7. You can also use the button on your calculator, which is slightly different than both of these. Okay, so if we were to type in 3.14 on our, actually, let's go to the calculator and I can show you. So if we were to type in 3.14, that's just 3.14. Okay, if I were to look at 22 over 7 as a decimal, I get 3.142857143. So it certainly rounds to 3.14. But then let's compare that to the actual button on the calculator. So if I were to use the button on my calculator, I get 3.141592654. Slightly different, okay? So 3.14 is an estimate for pi. 22 over 7 is another slightly different estimate for pi. The button on your calculator is a third slightly different estimate for pi. So you do have to be slightly careful when you're doing these circumference problems. If the problem tells you to use 3.14, use 3.14. Don't use the button on your calculator because you'll get a slightly different answer, okay? So let's go back to the worksheet. Okay, so here's the formula for circumference. To find the circumference of a circle, we take 2 times pi times the radius, or if you notice here, we have 2 times the radius, and I told you a minute ago, 2 times the radius is just the diameter. So if we wanted to, instead of saying 2 times pi times the radius, we could do just the diameter times pi. They're the exact same formula, and you kind of use one versus the other depending on what information you're given from your circle, okay? So let's look at a couple of examples. So for the first example, I've just titled it short answer. Okay. So it says for part A, it says a circle has a diameter of 14 meters. What is its radius? So imagine a circle, and through the center we have the diameter, and we're told that the diameter is 14 meters. Well, we know that if we're looking at the diameter, that's the distance all the way across the circle. Well, that is made up by two radii, is what we call them, but two sections called a radius. Okay? So if I have the diameter and I want the radius, all I have to do is take the diameter and divide it by 2, and that gives me the radius. So I would take 14 and divide it by 2, which gives me 7 meters. So that is the radius right there. Okay? Now for part B, it says a circle has a radius of 13.25 inches. What is the diameter? So we draw a circle. We have the radius is 13.25, but we know that when we have a circle like this, the distance through the circle, the distance across the circle through its center is made up of basically two sections called the radius. So if I wanted the diameter, I would take 2 times the radius. So I can take 2 times 13.25. So if we need to do a little work over here, that is fine. 13.25 might be easy enough for you all to do in your head, but we can do the work if we need to. So let's see, I would take 5 times 2, which is 10, so keep a 0, carry a 1. 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 1 is 2. And then I've got 2 decimal places in my first product. And then my second, not my first product, my first factor has 2 decimal places. My second factor has 0 decimal places. That tells me my product needs 2 decimal places. So I get 26.5, which is the same thing as 26.50. We just don't generally write those zeros on the end. So I would say the diameter here is 26.5 inches. Okay, so you need to understand the relationship between decimal and rate, or decimal. It's late. I might need to go to bed, huh? You need to understand the relationship between radius and diameter. Okay, so now let's actually practice finding the circumference of circles. Okay, so example 7 says find the circumference of each circle. And in the first example, we are given the distance from the center to the edge of the circle. So this is the radius. Okay, so I know that I have 2 formulas for the circumference of a circle. One is that capital C is the circumference, and it is 2 times pi times the radius. Or we can say circumference is the diameter times pi. Well, since I was given the radius, why not just use the formula that has r in it? Okay, so I would say the circumference is 2 times pi times the radius, which we know is 28. We were told to use 3.14 for pi. And remember, I've shown you that we have 3 kind of different estimates for pi. Use the one you're asked to use, otherwise your answer might be slightly off. Okay, so I really want 2 times 3.14 times 28. Well, I'm going to start with doing the easy multiplication first. I have 2 times 28. That's going to be easier for me. So off to the side, I've got 28 times 2. Well, 2 times 8 is 16, so I keep a 6, I carry a 1. And then 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. So this is really 56 times 3.14. Okay, and now I can do the side work for the harder multiplication. So I've got 3.14 times 56. Let me scroll down just a smidgen. Okay, so let's see. 6 times 4 is 24, so I'm going to keep a 4, carry a 2. 6 times 1 is 6, plus 2 is 8, and then 6 times 3 is 18. So I've multiplied by the number in the ones place. Now I need to multiply by the 5, which is in the tens place. So I'm going to put my 0 placeholder for the tens place, and then I'm going to multiply everything by 5. Okay? So 5 times 4 is 20. So I'm going to keep a 0. I'm going to carry a 2. And then 5 times 1 is 5, plus 2 is 7. And then finally, 5 times 3 is 15. I want to add my partial product. So let's see, I get 4, 8. 8 and 7 is 15. So I keep a 5, I carry a 1. 1 plus 1 plus 5 is 7. And then there's nothing to add to the 1, so I just drop it down. And we need to figure out decimal places or the decimal point for our product. So let's see. 3.14, my first factor, has 2 decimal places. 56 has 0 decimal places. So my final answer needs 2 decimal places. So I would say after a fair amount of work, nothing too crazy though, that the circumference of this circle is 175.84. We have units of meters, so we need to make sure we put meters in the final answer. Okay? So that's it. That's finding the circumference, okay? Now for part B, we know that we're again going to find the circumference, and this time they're telling us one more time, use 3.14 for pi. And in this case, I've been given that the diameter, that's the distance all the way through the circle, or all the way through the center across the circle, okay, the diameter is 18 inches. So this is the diameter. And since I've been given the diameter, why not use the formula that contains a d in it? So we have c equals the diameter, which is 18 times pi. Well, I was told flat out to use 3.14. So I'm going to do a little side work. I have 3.14 times 18. Well, 8 times 4 is 32, so I'm going to keep a 2 and carry a 3. 8 times 1 is 8, plus 3 is 11, so I'm going to keep a 1, carry a 1. And then 8 times 4 is 24, and then the 1 I carry makes it 25. So that was multiply. Oh, please put a 5 there. Now I have multiplied by what's in the ones place in 18. Now I need to multiply by what's in the tens place. So I'm going to put my 0 placeholder for the tens place here, and then multiply everything by 1. So 1 times 4 is 4, 1 times 1 is 1, and 1 times 3 is 3. I need to add my partial product. So let's see, we get 2 plus 0, 1 plus 4, 5 plus 1, and 3 plus 2. And let's figure out decimal point situation for the product. So my first factor has 2 decimal places. My second factor has 0 decimal places. That tells me my final product needs 2 plus 0 or 2 decimal places. So I get 56.52. So the circumference here is 56.52. The unit we were given for the diameter is inches, so my circumference is also in inches. Okay, so that is circumference of a circle. You need to understand the definition of circumference. You need to understand the definition of diameter and radius and how they're related. And you need to know that we're using pi. Okay, no big deal there. It's just a decimal equivalent for us at this point. So know that pi is always going to be an estimate, either 3.14, 22/7, or potentially your calculator button. Okay?